Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Is the audio coming through and the video coming through all right? I'm just waiting to hear if you can hear. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for your wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here this evening, or at least this evening my time, and probably different times of the day for everyone else. And I have just the greatest appreciation for the Irish Gurukul team for your wonderful endeavor to bring the ancient science of Veda throughout the world by using modern technology. It's a wonderful vision, and it's had very beautiful results, and I'm very, very honored and very grateful to be speaking this evening. And I just want to say thank you especially to dear Usha and Venkat and to the entire team. And what I wanted to speak with everyone about this evening is a program that we have at Maharishi University of Management here in Fairfield, Iowa, USA, where we learn to, all of the students and most of the faculty and staff, learn to read Sanskrit, learn to read the Devanagari script, learn to pronounce it properly and phonetically read it without attending to the meaning, the vocabulary, the sense of the term, of the language in the normal sense. It's an unusual sounding program simply because when we learn a language, if we were to learn French or Spanish or Hindi or Norwegian, we would learn the grammatical structures, would learn the vocabulary, would learn what the language means, would learn to read the poetry of the language and so forth. And in this unique situation, what Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who's the founder of our university, encouraged us to do was to learn just to read the text of Vedic literature phonetically. And by doing that, it would accelerate the growth of consciousness. Maharishi University of Management is an institution that teaches the traditional academic disciplines. It teaches mathematics and English literature and science, engineering, all of the standard things you would learn at any university. But it also teaches them in the light of Maharishi Vedic science, which is Maharishi's interpretation of the ancient Vedic tradition of knowledge. Every student learns the Transcendental Meditation technique, Maharishi's meditation. Every faculty member already practices it every year, every day, twice a day. We practice together in beautiful, huge golden domes. I was hoping to show some pictures of the campus just so you'd get a sense of it, but it doesn't seem to work technologically. But basically the university has 10 bachelor programs, 4 master's degrees, 2 PhD programs, has over 1,200 students, 400 of which are undergraduates, about 800 of which are graduate students. They come from 32 of the US states, 32 out of 50, and 87 different countries throughout the world. We have students from everywhere these days, and our campus is a completely international community of people who come from all over the world to learn the basic disciplines of a university education, and also to learn how to develop their own consciousness, to grow quickly towards higher states of consciousness. It was over 20 years ago that Maharishi suggested this program, and in order to familiarize you with the basic I guess you could say the logic behind the program, I want to start at what may be for some a very simple, mundane level of understanding. I understand there are people from all different parts of the world that are listening today and that will be listening to the recordings. And for some of you, your understanding is very advanced, and others perhaps more on the beginning level. So I want to begin at the most basic level and give you an understanding of how it is that Sanskrit can actually enliven our own consciousness and develop us more quickly towards higher states of consciousness. In the Vedic cosmological viewpoint, the most fundamental level of nature's functioning, you could say, is a field of consciousness. The most basic level of life is an unbounded, infinite field of pure consciousness, pure intelligence. Maharishi used to often refer to it as being, a state of just being, infinite creativity, infinite intelligence, infinite energy. He also used to use the term self-referral consciousness, because on that level of life, consciousness refers only to itself. It's not conscious of anything, it's just an ocean of consciousness, an ocean of being, an ocean of awareness. And one of the characteristics of this field of intelligence is that it's a field of bliss, complete fulfillment, complete happiness, completely blissful nature. And the Taittiriya Upanishad expresses this reality when it describes the most fundamental value of life as a field of bliss from which everything comes and to which everything goes. And some of you may be familiar with the verse that goes like this: Ananda dhyeva kalvimani bhutani jayante, anandena jatani jivanti, anandam prayantyabhisam vishanti. From bliss these beings are born, in bliss they are sustained, and to bliss they go and merge again. And this is the ultimate reality of life: infinite consciousness, infinite bliss, unending ocean of life, life itself. And the fortunate thing about this field of intelligence is that it's available to everyone. It's available deep within each of us as the most fundamental level of our own intelligence. It's the source of thought, the source of our creativity, the source of our intellectual activity, the source of our dreams, our hopes, our aspirations. Everything that we are, everything we do, has its source in this infinite field of bliss. Maharishi taught his Transcendental Meditation technique for over 50 years throughout the world, and the purpose of that technique is to allow the awareness to settle down very easily and effortlessly and very quietly to experience this ocean of bliss. And again, going back to the Upanishads, there are two expressions that I'd like to remind everyone of that describe this infinite field as our own self, our own Atma. And the first is from the Nrisinghotara Tapaniya Upanishad, which says, Shivam Shantam Advaitam Chaturtham Manyante Sa Atma Savigneyaha. The peaceful, the blissful, the undivided is thought to be the fourth state of consciousness. That is the self, that is to be known, that is Atma, that is our own self. So this Upanishad is telling us that this field of intelligence that underlies all of creation and that permeates every grain of creation is also our own self, our own awareness. The Brihad Aranyak Upanishad also says something similar. It says, Atma va are drashtavya, shrotavya, mantavya, nididhyasitavyaha. That Atma alone, that state of simplest form of awareness alone, is worthy of seeing, hearing, contemplating, and realizing. And so what that Upanishad tells us is that this field of bliss, this field of infinite creativity, not only is there within us, but it is to be known. It should be known. We should contact it. We should enjoy it. And in fact, in Maharishi Vedic science, Maharishi talks about higher states of consciousness, and even though there are a number of them that we won't have time to go into the descriptions of today, these states of consciousness are characterized by bringing out this infinite intelligence so that it can be lived all the time. So that even when we're going to the bank and we go to work and we're with our family and we do whatever jobs that we have, that infinite state of joy, that infinite state of consciousness, that infinite creativity and intelligence is always available. It's always there. It's the reality of our own lives. Maharishi used to talk about this in terms of an analogy. He said the ocean of consciousness is like the ocean of water. And the ocean of water, we know, rises up in waves, rises up in individual waves. And hypothetically, we could think of these waves as even forgetting that the ocean is at its basis. A wave could think, I'm a wave, I'm an individual wave, I'm all that there is, and forget about the ocean completely. But it's always there beneath, it's always there below. And that ocean can be brought to the awareness, can be brought to life, so that one lives both the individual value and the cosmic value together at the same time. This is the purpose of the techniques such as Transcendental Meditation and Maharishi's TM Siddhi program, which have been practiced throughout the world by, I think it's over 7 million people today who enjoy it 20 minutes twice a day and so forth. And they bring some value of this consciousness out and are developing higher states of consciousness throughout the course of their lives. Now, the reason that that Maharishi asked us to learn to read Sanskrit is very interesting, and it requires a little bit of explanation about how this infinite level of consciousness, this infinite creativity and intelligence, how that actually becomes a material universe, how it expresses itself as the forms and phenomena around us. When we think of consciousness, we know it to be completely abstract. We know that consciousness is almost conceptual. It's an abstract form. It's an abstract value of life, and yet the material world is very concrete. We can touch it, taste it, smell it, feel it, hear it, and so forth. So how is it that consciousness becomes matter? Maharishi used to outline a number of stages in this unfolding, and we don't have to go into all of those here. But the main idea that he used to discuss is that this vast, silent, infinite ocean of consciousness, this peaceful silence, moves within itself. Its characteristic is that it's silent, but it's also dynamic. It moves within itself. It's like as though it churns within itself. And there are many stories throughout the Puranas that describe a churning of the ocean, and Maharishi used to feel that was the metaphorically the description of the ocean of consciousness churning within itself. And when it moves within itself, you can say that it interacts with itself. It creates what physicists call, in terms of unified field theory, and what Maharishi would call in terms of Vedic science, it creates a self-interacting dynamics. And when consciousness moves within itself, when it interacts with itself, it creates a kind of sound. A kind of sound. It's like a hum. It's not a sound that we hear through the ears. It's not something that when you're walking down the street you would hear this sound, but rather it's heard when consciousness is open to itself. Going back to the metaphor of the wave in the ocean, it occurs when the waves in the ocean settle down, when they experience their own unbounded nature, and on that level, then this sound can be heard. And initially it is heard as a hum, just a continuous hum. But as one's physiology becomes increasingly refined through regular practice of the different, what you could call technologies of consciousness, then one begins to be more and more capable of appreciating the components of that hum. And the components are different values of sound. Now, to use analogy or a metaphor, imagine ourselves walking down the road towards a carnival or a market, some noisy collection of human beings that's in the distance, and you're on the road walking towards it, and the first thing you hear is just a sound. You can't distinguish the different components of the sound, but you just hear this roar of the crowd. But as you get closer, then you begin to hear this conversation and that conversation. You begin to hear people laughing, and maybe people bartering, and people doing this and having a good time, and yelling playful at each other and so forth. You hear all the different components of what was before just one continuous sound. The same is true on the level of consciousness. When the awareness first is capable of appreciating this hum, then it enjoys the hum. But over time, as one continues to have that experience, then he or she begins to be capable of experiencing the components as different values of sound. These sounds express themselves as the laws of nature that govern the entire creation. These are the laws of nature that create matter, that structure the material world, and that administer it, and that have been administering it for millions of years at this point. These are the different sounds. They're called devata. Devata is often translated as gods, but Maharishi explained that what these are is principles in nature. They're principles of nature's functioning. They're laws of nature, and they govern everything from the movement of the planets. They govern the interactions of our own physiology, the movement of subatomic particles. They govern how the heart beats and the lung beats, and or the lungs breathe, and how we behave, how we speak, how we talk to our friends, how we listen, and so forth. Everything that takes place in the universe is governed by the different laws of nature. But on their most fundamental level, they have that quality of sound. Millennia ago, the ancient rishis, ancient seers of the Vedic tradition, within themselves listened to these sounds. They heard these sounds. They appreciated these sounds, and they recorded them. They recorded them in terms of the sounds of what we call the Vedic literature. Vedic literature includes texts that we may have already heard of: Rik Ved, Samaved, Yajurved, Atharvaved, the Upanishad, Aranyakas, Brahmanas, and so forth. All of these different texts are not books fundamentally. This was a point that Maharishi made over and over. Ved is not found in books. It's found within consciousness. It's found within each of us. We all have Ved within our own consciousness. Our entire physiologies are made out of Ved. And the rishis recorded the sounds. They recorded them in, they expressed them orally. They were passed down in a long, long, long oral tradition. When writing came about and palm leaf manuscripts were invented, then the text began to be written down and then passed down that way. And today, these texts come to us as the Vedic literature. And Vedic literature, on one hand, we could say that the books we find in the library are the Vedic literature, but ultimately the Vedic literature is within our own consciousness. It's within consciousness. It's the laws of nature, the sounds and the sequence of sounds structure the entire creation, the entire world around us, and our own consciousness, our own awareness. So when we read the Vedic sounds, when we pick up an Upanishad, when we pick up the Nyaya Sutras, when we pick up Yoga Sutras, and we read them, we're reading the sounds of nature's functioning. And Maharishi identified what he felt to be 40 different areas of Vedic literature. The 40 different areas include the Upanishads, the Aranyakas, the Brahmanas, the Nyaya Sutras, Nyaya, Vaisheshik, Sankhya, Yoga, Karma, Mimamsa, Vedanta, Shiksha, Kalp, Vyakaran, Nirupchan, Jyotish, and all of these, what we think of as texts, we may think of as texts, exhibit particular qualities of consciousness. They unfold particular qualities of consciousness, particular qualities of our own awareness. And when we enliven these, then it helps to unfold our consciousness further. What Maharishi often used to say was, close the eyes and meditate, and then open the eyes and read the Vedic literature. Close the eyes and meditate, then open the eyes and read the Vedic literature. What that means is, close the eyes, practice. At our university, we practice Maharishi's Transcendental Meditation technique. We practice that technique. The awareness very effortlessly and simply settles into samadhi. It's an effortless practice. It requires no great intelligence, no great discipline, no great struggle or effort or concentration. It's simple and effortless. And that allows the awareness to settle into the deepest value of ourself, our own Atma, our own self. And then when we come out of meditation, there's some liveliness of those qualities. And so when one reads the Vedic literature immediately after, then it has the value of enlivening those qualities of intelligence that are captured by the Vedic literature in our own awareness. So for example, if we decided to read Ramayana, Ramayana is a beautiful epic. It tells the story of Ram and Sita and Hanuman and all of the different individuals that went through to make that great epic. But when we read Ramayana, it also has a quality of intelligence, the quality of the total blossoming of our own intelligence that it enlivens. And so this acts as an accelerator to our own consciousness. Now, there's a very, very interesting research project that has taken place in about 10 years ago, where Dr. Tony Nader, who was very close to Maharishi, spent many years studying with Maharishi, and he's a medical doctor, And he had also a PhD in physiology, so he's very, very conversant with different physiological functions. He understood the physiology, human body, both in terms of its structure and the different functions and the different relationships between the organs and organ systems and so forth, understands them very deeply. And under Maharshi's guidance, Dr. Nader discovered that the 40 branches of Vedic literature correspond to 40 different parts of the physiology, both in structure and in function. And what that means is that if you take a particular branch of the Vedic literature, such as Nyaya Sutras, that the structure of the Nyaya Sutras, in terms of its chapter, the terms of the number of sutras in each chapter, in terms of the subdivisions of the chapters, in terms of the 16 components of Nyaya, for those who are familiar with Nyaya, you know that in the first sutra it discusses pramana, prameya, sanchaya, prayojana, 16 different characteristics. And what he found was that these 16 qualities of intelligence correspond to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, let me just look at it because I'm not a physiologist myself. I'm sorry, to the thalamus. And that these 16 qualities correspond to the 16-fold structure of the thalamus. And that of each of those characteristics, pramana, prameya, sanjaya, prayojana, in their function, they correspond to the different aspects of thalamic functioning. And he went through all of the 40 branches of the Vedic literature. He went through all of the different systems and organ systems of the physiology, and he showed that there's a one-to-one correspondence. And the conclusion of this research project was, there's several conclusions. One is that the physiology is indeed made out of consciousness. It's made out of Ved. It's made out of the sounds of Ved. And that by reading the different texts of the Vedic literature, that one enlivens those aspects of the physiology to which they correspond. The reason this is important is that the physiology is very intimately related to our development of consciousness. We think of consciousness in an abstract sense, and we may think of the development of consciousness as an abstract endeavor, but in reality it's very closely connected to the entire neurophysiological functioning of the human physiology. We have a brain physiology, we have a nervous system, we have many, many different systems within the physiology. And in order to grow to higher states of consciousness, we need to remove the impediments to smooth physiological functioning. We all know that when we get sick, if we have a cold, the mind doesn't work as clearly. If we get some disease, some temporary disease, then it may not be possible to think clearly, make logical decisions. It may inhibit different aspects of the brain. We may not understand consequences as well as we might. And then when the disease is gone, our mental functioning comes back. Similarly, in order to develop higher states of consciousness, it's necessary that the entire physiology be functioning in a completely balanced way. That the brain physiology be functioning without stress, without impediments, and so forth. So by reading the Vedic literature in Sanskrit, by reading a particular part of the literature, then that part of the physiology to which that aspect of the literature corresponds can be brought more into balance, can be brought more into that state of life that the Creator intended it to function on. We know that we don't use our full potential, our mental potential. Scientists differ in terms of their estimates. You hear 5%, 10%, 15% of our full potential. This is a way to unfold the different aspects of the physiology so that they can contribute towards the growth and development of higher states of consciousness. So it's a very profound and very important research project that Dr. Nader undertook. He very recently published a second book, a very magnificent book that took over 10 years to prepare, where he went through, again under Maharshi's guidance, through the entire Ramayana, the entire great epic of the Ramayana. And the idea was that branches of the Vedic literature, such as the Ramayana, Mahabharata, which tell very beautiful stories, describe natural law. They describe the functioning of natural law. And what he undertook to see was whether every individual in the Ramayana, every interaction within the Ramayana, to see if that would illustrate different facets of physiological functioning. And he found again that the physiology is a perfect expression of Ramayana. Now when you think of it for a second, it's a very, very complex undertaking, because if you say that, well, Ram is Ram is the expression of the left knee, then you have to find Bharat, Shatrughna, you have to find Sita, you have to find Hanuman, every single time they interact, and show that that interaction on the level of the story corresponds to a physiological interaction between the parts that you attribute to Hanuman and the part you attribute to Ram and so forth. Very, very complex process. But he went through it in a very beautiful way and created this work that shows in a completely internally consistent way that the Ramayana is a perfect expression of the functions of human physiology, that the interaction of every individual, the interactions between Ram and Ravan, the interactions between Lakshman and Hanuman correspond to specific functioning within the human physiology, within the human nervous system. So reading the Ramayana has that special value of creating balance in the entire nervous system throughout the entire physiology. There was a number of years ago, I gave a presentation similar to this to the 10th International Sanskrit Conference in Bangalore, India. And an individual, an elderly man who was a Sanskrit teacher in Gujarat, stood up at the end, and he was very delighted with the whole presentation. He had never heard about this relationship between physiology and Vedic literature, but he felt very happy about it. And he said, "This reminds me of a verse from Rig Veda." And he said the verse goes like this: "Richo akshare parame vyoman yasmin deva adhivishve nisheduhu yastannaved kim richa karishyati ya itad vidusta eme samasate." And this verse, I'm familiar with it because it also happens to be one of Maharshi's favorite verses that he used to quote all of the time, and Maharshi was extremely delighted when he heard this story. What it means is, what it says is, the riches of the Ved, the expressions of Ved, of all of the Vedic literature, are structured in the eternal dynamics of consciousness. They're structured parame vyoman, in the transcendental field. Richo akshare parame vyoman yasmin deva adhivishve nisheduhu, in which all of the different impulses of consciousness, the laws of nature, the devata, in which they find their home. And then the verse goes on to say, Yastanaved kim richa karishyati. He who does not know it, what can these verses possibly do for him or her? He who does not know it means one whose awareness is not on that level, one who thinks that Veda and Vedic literature are just ancient books, ancient fables and myths and ancient philosophies, and if they don't know that these expressions come directly or are structured directly in the intelligence underlying all of creation, then what can they possibly do for them? But he who does not know it, he exists in evenness and wholeness of life. Ya itad vidus ta ame samasate. He who knows it lives in wholeness, in totality. And this is a very beautiful summary of this understanding of Veda and Vedic literature that is structured within our own consciousness. And that when we read it, we enliven those qualities of consciousness, we enliven our intelligence. Maharshi recommended to us that we not read the primary texts, such as Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda, simply because in his mind, they're such compact expressions that they really need to be read by pundits who have been trained. You know, the pundits have learned from a very early age, from the age of 8, 9, 10 years old, and they spend their lives and their pronunciation is very exacting. Whereas someone such as myself, I might learn some Sanskrit later in life and my pronunciation will never be good, or never be on the level of a pundit, certainly. And so we read everything else. We read all of the Nyaya Sutras, Vaisheshik Sutras, Yoga Sutras, Karma Mimamsa, Vedanta, and so forth. And these have wonderful experiences. They give rise to wonderful experiences. I wanted to read one from a friend of mine who documented her experiences reading the Brahma Sutras. And as soon as I locate it, I will read it. It's a beautiful expression of what this can do for you. She said, when I was reading the Brahma Sutras, I was reading, and there was still this small body that I knew was mine, but the reality at the same time was that there were no boundaries at all containing me. What was myself went on forever, and there was a very concrete knowingness that I had always been that, had reached what I really was, that I could finally be truly at rest, that I had come home. Everything rested within and was supported by me, and so I knew everything there was to know. I had the perception of being a gigantic mother eagle whose wings encircled and sheltered the whole universe, so that I felt responsible for keeping everything alive and growing. The impression of that final experience was one of complete freedom and mastery, sublime bliss, lively silence, and absolute, almost ridiculously utter simplicity, all on the surface of my being. Every fiber of my being seemed alive with realization. I really am the Vade. I truly am the totality. And there's some wonderful expressions from the Vedic literature, from the Upanishads. Vedaham Vedoham. I know the Vade, I am the Vade. I know the Vade, I am the Vade. I know Vade, I am Vade. Maharishi spoke to this once, and he said, you know Vade by being Vade. You cognize Vade by being Vade. Cognition of the Vade is on its own level, and that is that level in which we get into the details of wakefulness. Veda is the detailed structure of pure wakefulness, and there the intellect does not go. That beautifully encapsulates Maharishi's vision of Vade, because it's not something one experiences in the normal sense of our experience, where we see something that's separate from ourselves. We look across the room, we see a door. There's two things that are going on, three really. There's myself, there's the door, and then there's the interaction between myself and the door, where I process the cognition of the door. When one experiences Vade deep within one's own consciousness, one is not experiencing something other than oneself. One is experiencing one's own consciousness and the reverberations within it. So one hears the Vade, hears the sounds of Vade, but knows that those sounds are the sounds of his own consciousness reverberating. So I'll read this quote again. It's, you know Vade by being Vade. You cognize Vade by being Vade. Cognition of Vade is on its own level, and that is that level in which we get into the details of wakefulness. Veda is the detailed structure of pure wakefulness, our own consciousness, our own Atma. And there the intellect does not go. In order to really know Vade, and this brings us up to another very interesting point, in order to really undertake Vedic study doesn't take place by reading the books. I mean, that's one level of Vedic study, and that has its own value. And it's very inspiring, and we can learn many things by reading the Vedic texts. But ultimately, Vedic study should be the exploration of our own consciousness, the exploration of the sounds on their own most fundamental level, the exploration of that hum within us and the component of the hum, and to hear that sound and to explore it and to enjoy it and to understand it as the reverberations of one's own consciousness. We have here at Maharishi University of Management, we have a master's degree program in Maharishi Vedic Science, where we basically study Maharishi's teaching about Veda and Vedic literature with respect to all aspects of life. We read Maharishi's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, but we also study the application of this knowledge to different areas of life, to education, to health, to government, how it can be used to create a better society. Because in Maharishi's view, if everything comes from Veda, if everything is an expression of these vibrations that are deep within our own consciousness, if everything comes from Veda, then doesn't it make sense that everything should be Vedic? Shouldn't education be Vedic? Shouldn't government be a Vedic government? Shouldn't healthcare be Vedic healthcare? Shouldn't architecture be Vedic architecture? Most of the buildings, we're working on this as we go along, but most of the buildings here at Maharishi University of Management are built according to Sthapatya Veda, the Vedic system of architecture, which are designed so that one can live in accord with natural law, that one would live more comfortably, more healthily, more in the way that nature intended, by both working and living in Sthapatya Vedic buildings. More and more every year, our buildings here at Maharishi University Management are built according to this structure. If anybody's ever had the opportunity to go inside a Stapatya house or a Stapatya office building, they're being built all over the United States right now. There's I think it's a 20-story office building in Washington, D.C. is built according to the principles of Stapatya. You feel differently in it. You act differently. You think differently. In this one office building in Washington, D.C., there are many people who don't know much about Stapatya. They don't practice Transcendental Meditation. They're just companies that rent office space. And yet they all remark on how much they enjoy being in there. And they enjoy the feeling and that they work more coherently and more clearly at their jobs. All of the different elements. Anyway, we study all of this in our master's degree program. Then we have a doctoral program. The doctoral program for the dissertation phase, one has many choices about what to do one's dissertation on. I did mine on the Valmiki Ramayana. But others take a program where they spend 2.5 years reading for 4 hours a day the Vedic literature. That's all they do. They practice their Transcendental Meditation and TM City program in the morning. Then they read for 4 hours during the day, 4 hours, and then they practice their evening Transcendental Meditation program, and they document their experiences. They write down what the experiences are, what they experienced that day, and then at the end of 2.5 years, then they begin writing their dissertation, and they write a dissertation that documents what they enjoyed, what they experienced, what it did to them. And to be quite honest with you, the experiences are spectacular. Very, very beautiful experiences of higher states of consciousness, where they talk about the infinite, unbounded self, the infinite, unbounded ocean of pure existence, and then proceeding on to even higher states of consciousness, where they see everything in terms of themselves. The entire environment in the state of unity consciousness is one in which one experiences everything as nothing other than an expression of their own consciousness. And they take this as a scientific endeavor. They generally they have a long discussion about the history of science, the philosophy of science, and how science studies different things. And the thing about studying the self, the thing about studying one's own consciousness, is that it's a state of pure subjectivity. It's not something that one even can study from an objective point of view. It's a state of subjectivity and can only be appreciated, can only be experienced as a subjective value of life. You can study to some extent when someone is experiencing the self within. You can measure their brainwave patterns, and they're very interesting. There are over 700 studies, published studies, many of them in peer-reviewed academic and scientific journals. Good, yeah, that's a good slide to hold on for just a second. I'm almost there. Many of the studies are in peer-reviewed academic journals where they study the effects on the physiology, on the mind, on behavior, on the environment of people practicing Transcendental Meditation and the TM City program. But the purest form of study can only be undertaken on the level of the self itself, because there is no objective experience as one identifies oneself with that infinite value of consciousness. However, quite a lot of research has been done objectively on the physiology, and this first slide that you can see that's entitled "The Brain is Not," and something's blocking it for me, but the brain is not a rock, it's a river. And what that means is our brain responds to sensory experience. It responds to what we experience during the day, during the week, during the year, and adjusts and modifies itself. What you expose your brain to determines what the brain physiology is. Just to give a very obvious example, if you wanted to learn to play a violin, you'd never played a musical instrument before, you would practice very hard, and the attention on the mind-body coordination that's necessary in order to play a violin enlivens certain aspects of the physiology that make it less of a struggle, that you get better at it, the mind-body coordination works more effectively, more efficiently. That comes from practice, and it comes from practice because the brain begins to develop certain connections, certain aspects of its anatomical structure, so that you can better and better play the violin. When you subject your awareness to samadhi, to the self, to Atma, when you practice meditation, the awareness settles down into that ocean of being, then it begins to change the brain structure, it begins to change the brain physiology. It makes the brain waves more coherent. It makes the different brain waves begin to function more in accord with each other. And as it says in this chart, over 70% of synaptic connections change every day. So if you expose it to Atma, to the infinite intelligence within, and if you expose it to the Vedic literature, reading the sounds of Ramayana and Mahabharata and Nyaya and Vaisheshik and Sankhya, not the commentaries, just the primary text. The primary texts are the Vedic expressions. The commentaries on Nyaya and the commentaries on Brahma Sutras and Vaisheshik Sutras and all, we don't consider that Vedic expressions because those are man-made commentaries. But the primary texts are created from within consciousness. When you expose your awareness to that, then your brain waves will change. Your brain physiology will change. And this is how enlightenment, how higher states of consciousness develops, by subjecting the brain to very, very profound levels of functioning, and then coming out and just doing what you do in life. If we could have the next slide. I'm not a physiologist, so I can't go into a great deal of this, but EEG coherence measures the harmony of the brain. There are different things you can measure when you measure EEG coherence, but one of them, EEG measures the electrical activity, and then coherence measures how the different parts of the brain interact with each other. In other words, you can put electrical leads on the frontal lobe, on the different sides, on the posterior lobe, on the different parts of the brain physiology. And then you can map out the brainwave patterns and compare them to each other. Normally what happens to an individual, to a person, is that one brain wave will look like this, and then the one on the other side will look somewhat differently. They won't be what you could call coherent. But what has been found is that when people practice Transcendental Meditation, a huge amount of research has been done on people practicing Transcendental Meditation simply because there are so many people who have been doing it for 35, 40 years, and so there are quite a lot of subjects. People enjoy it. People practice it twice a day without ever missing. They do it for 35, 40 years. They document their experiences. But it also gives us wonderful test subjects. And what is found is that when someone practices Transcendental Meditation, even in the first days and weeks and months, the brainwave patterns begin to be more coherent, meaning that if you measure the right and the left and the front and the back, what you'll find is that the brainwave patterns will be coherent. They'll be synchronous. The patterns will be going along with each other. And what that seems to indicate is that the different parts of the brain can function more coherently. They function more as a consolidated unit rather than as individual parts. Rather than that is individual parts that kind of go their own way, they begin to function together. Now, this coherence begins to appear right in the early days of meditation, but what's found is that after a little bit longer time, then that EEG coherence begins to be experienced outside of meditation, in activity. So someone goes to their job at the bank, someone goes to their job as a construction worker or a carpenter or whatever they do, a school teacher, and there's a little bit more brainwave coherence after just a few months. And then after a few years, more brain coherence, not just during meditation, but outside. And this is a result of the brain physiology accustoming itself to that level of functioning and learning to maintain it while one's engaged in activity. At first, it's just during meditation, and then it becomes active and noticeable during the activity of the day. So if we could have the next slide. I just have a few slides here, but they'll show you some of the preliminary research. EEG coherence, this is important. It indicates how the brain functions together, but it's also been scientifically correlated with increased creativity, improved concept learning, improved moral reasoning, improved IQ, higher grade point average, decreased neuroticism, increased H reflex, whatever that is. I'm not a neurophysiologist. Moral reasoning, I think, is one of the most interesting because we have many, many behavioral studies that show that individuals begin to just act in a more morally responsible way. One famous area of study is in the rehabilitation context. We find that prisoners, when they leave prison, don't come back to prison. We don't counsel them on how to behave, but they just begin to not break laws. They begin to not break rules. Children in schools begin to be less, less naughty. They tend to be less mischievous. and function more in a very calm and easy and happy way. They become less problems for particularly children that are problems. So EEG coherence is an important measure. If I could have the next slide. And this is the one that's relevant to this. All this was explanation of our of this kind of research. Dr. Fred Travis is the department chair of the Department of Maharishi Vedic Science here at MUM, and he is a brain scientist. He studies the changes in brain physiology, particularly as one grows towards higher states of consciousness. And what he found, and this is preliminary research, it's not quite ready yet to go to peer-reviewed journals, but it's getting there. He's doing quite a lot of research, and he found that the frontal EEG coherence and power increased while reading Sanskrit or practicing Transcendental Meditation, but not while reading other languages that the subjects didn't understand. In other words, if you took a study and you taught someone who didn't know anything about French, and you teach them the French alphabet, they can read it. Most English speakers can read it because it's the same alphabet. And they read the French, but they don't know what it means. It doesn't have much effect on the EEG coherence. It doesn't change the brain physiology. And it doesn't bring them, it doesn't bring happiness, it doesn't bring bliss as does reading Sanskrit. Whereas when people were practicing reading Sanskrit, then they had the same frontal EEG coherence and power as one did practicing Transcendental Meditation. It means something very good is going on, something very powerful and very important. There was another study that I don't have a slide for. It was done years ago, and it was just a preliminary classroom kind of study. But it indicated that when students practiced Transcendental Meditation, and then when they read the Vedic literature in Sanskrit, in the Devanagari script, with good pronunciation, then they felt much happier, much fuller, much more expanded, as did the person whose experience I read a few moments ago. If we could have the next slide, just a few other measures that Dr. Travis cited. Galvanic skin resistance measures the amount of sweat on the skin. High resistance, no sweat. Galvanic skin resistance relates to the amount of emotions, such as fear, anger, etc., one is feeling, and high skin resistance indicates one has a greater ability to stay cool. This is a study that's been done many times. One of the first studies was done on people practicing the Transcendental Meditation technique, and they found that galvanic skin response rose significantly, indicating that the state itself was one of very low stress, and that persisted after the practice. If we could have the next slide rather. Galvanic skin resistance increased while reading Sanskrit or practicing Transcendental Meditation, but again, not while reading a foreign language that the subject didn't understand. So if you read French without understanding the meaning, doesn't seem to do you much good, but there is an effect from reading Sanskrit. This is all preliminary research, but it's something Dr. Travis is focusing more and more time on in order to corroborate the subjective experiences of those who are taking part in the PhD program, where they're reading Sanskrit every day for 2.5 hours, for 4 hours, for many, many months, for 2.5 years as part of their doctoral work. If I could have the last, we have on campus these days Acharya Gopal Krishna Dave. He's from Gujarat, and he was Maharishi's main pundit for over 30 years. Acharya Dave worked very closely with Maharishi on just about everything having to do with Sanskrit and the Vedic literature, many publications, and so forth. He was very, very dear to Maharishi and was very close to him and has a great, deep, profound understanding of the principles of Maharishi Vedic science. And he's recently come to Maharishi University of Management to help us with our Sanskrit program and to teach pronunciation. It used to be, before Acharya Dave was here, that people like myself would teach Sanskrit, and you know, when someone repeats after me, they don't get quite the same effect as when they repeat after a Vedic pundit, such as Acharya Dave. He has very beautiful pronunciation, and it's made a significant difference in their experiences. The students, he's just been here for about 6 months, and already the students who have been studying with him have said that their experience from reading Sanskrit, from reading the Vedic literature, has become much more profound, much more subtle, much deeper, that experience much more of the unbounded value of pure self-referral consciousness than they did before. They always had good experiences before, but they say they're much richer and they're much deeper. So we're very delighted to have Acharyaji here, and we hope that he stays with us for many years, but it's going to become a constant feature of our university and of our Sanskrit teaching all over the world. We have schools and universities on just about every continent. They're all over the world, in South America and in South Africa, in Europe, in Asia, many schools in India, and so forth. And so all of them will be focusing more now on having Sanskrit taught by a Vedic Pandit, because we've had such great results from it. I think this is pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but I'd love if people have time, I'd love to entertain some questions, and if there's an opportunity to do that. I'm sorry if some couldn't see the slides. I'm seeing some things come up on the chat. The chat has been turned off during the presentation, but I believe it's being turned on now. I'm sorry if you couldn't see the slides, but hopefully I gave enough commentary to give you the idea. There was nothing that I think that was on the slides that I didn't repeat verbally. And you might be able to move the media player from away from the chat board. And you're very welcome for those who have enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed speaking with everybody today. I enjoy talking about this subject very much. And I really very much appreciate your all being there. And I also very deeply appreciate the whole Gurukul team who have done such a fantastic job of making available all of the different subject matter all over the world, as they say, without, as Usha said, without us leaving our living rooms. We don't have to travel. We don't have to make airline reservations. Yes, now someone asked, can we get the detailed relationship of Veda and physiology? There's a book that's printed, and the name of the book is, I'll hold it up, let me get it, and I'll hold it up to the screen. I don't know if you can read it. I'll read the titles and everything. It's called Human Physiology, Expression of Veda and the Vedic Literature by Tony Nader, MD, PhD. I should mention that Dr. Nader, when Maharishi, just before Maharishi passed on, he asked Dr. Nader to take over the administration of all of Maharishi's worldwide movement. We refer to him now as a title and a name that Maharishi gave him, Maharaj Adhiraj Rajaram, and he's in charge of all of Maharishi's undertakings all over the world, which are quite a lot. And the reason was because he's found himself to be, on the level of knowledge, he's the best. He understands Maharishi's knowledge so profoundly, and he has this beautiful understanding. I'll read, somebody asked about what the different branches of the Vedic literature are, and I'll read them to make sure I don't forget. Rigved, Samaved, Yajurved, Atharvaved, and then the 6 Vedangas, Shiksha, Kalp, Vyakaran, Nirukt, Chand, Jyotish, then the Upangas, Nyaya, Vaisheshik, Sankhya, Yoga, Karma Mimamsa, Vedanta, and then Upaved, Gandharva Veda. Gandharva Veda is the Vedic science of music. All of the beautiful Indian classic music are all expressions of Gandharva Veda. Gandharva Veda, Dhanur Veda, Sthapatya Veda, Harit Sanghita, Bheo Sanghita, Kashyap Sanghita, Charak Sanghita, Sushut Sanghita, and Vagbhat Sanghita, Madhav Nidan Sanghita, Shangadhar Sanghita, Bhav Prakash Sanghita. These last 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, are all fundamental Ayurvedic texts. I'll read them again because they're not as familiar probably. Harit Sanghita, Bhel Sanghita, Kashyap Sanghita, Charak Sanghita, Sushut Sanghita, Vagbhat Sanghita, Madhav Nidan Sanghita, Shangadhar Sanghita, Bhav Prakash Sanghita. And then there's the Brahmana section of the Brahmana section, Upanishad, Aranyak, Brahmana, Itihas, Puran, and Smriti. And then the last section of the Pratishakyas, Rigved Pratishakya, Shukla Yajurved Pratishakya, Atharvaved Pratishakya, Atharvaved Pratishakya Chaturadhyayi, Krishna Yajurved Pratishakya, Samaved Pratishakya. And that's 40 altogether. Also I want to show you Dr. Nader's other book. This is Ramayan in Human Physiology. See, it's hard to figure out exactly how to get it, but you can see it's a lovely picture on the front. You see a human head with Ram, Sita, Lakshman, and Hanuman all inside the brain. And that is the idea, is that the story of the Ramayan tells a story of human physiology. It tells a story of human physiology from birth through enlightenment. It tells how an individual grows, how the different connections are made between the somatosensory and supplementary motor cortex and the entire nervous system and the entire physiology, and how those are brought up to the level of enlightenment. You might guess, for those familiar with the Ramayan, that Ravan and the Rakshasas represent malfunctioning parts of the physiology, and also stress being the impediment to smooth physiological functioning. And let's see what else we got in terms of questions. Good, I guess that's all the... So have we run out of time, Usha? Yeah, somebody's asking if the lecture can be listened to again. It's being taped, and it'll be played again. I don't know exactly the mechanics, but maybe Usha can enlighten us on that. Good. So I guess we've run out of time here. So again, I want to thank everybody. It's been really a delight, talking to you. It says here, yes, you can click. Oops, I lost it. It goes by too fast. You can click on a link to hear the recording, but I'm not sure exactly when. Yeah, 20 more minutes. Okay. So I'd be happy to ask some more questions. They kind of stopped coming, so I thought maybe we were turning it off. Do I scroll down for questions or scroll up? Where's it most recent? Oh, our tongue? What does that mean? You mean the physical tongue? How Sanskrit affects our tongue? Sir, can you explain more? Or does that mean tongue like the physical tongue, or tongue our native language? I would not answer in terms of the physical tongue. You mean the little thing in our mouth. But if you're talking about how Sanskrit affects our language, in the traditional understanding, Sanskrit is the first child, you could say, of the Vedic language. Vedic language is the sounds deep within. It's the sounds of self-referral consciousness humming within itself, of Atma humming within itself. That's the Vedic language. And in the Vedic tradition, the Sanskrit is the first child of that. It's the first expression. And it's at these sounds, the Vedic language, this hum is the basis of all languages. Modern linguists divide things up in different ways, but that's the tradition of the Vedic, in the Vedic tradition. I hope that answers the question. I hope that helps. Anything else? I think I'm at... it says, will we be able to see the slides in the tape lecture? I think so. Usha, wouldn't they be able to see that in the tape version? Yes. Yes, here's something written on. Sanskrit is considered as the mother of all languages. That's the tradition of the Vedic tradition. The term Sanskritam literally means refined, and the form it is known today follows rules of Panini, the legendary Sanskrit grammarian of 5th century BC. Modern computer experts have agreed upon Sanskrit, your message here. Yes. Any other questions? There don't seem to be any coming up. So presumably everybody's happy? Yeah, it seems to be, somebody says, when I had attempted to read some Vedic texts like the Brahma Sutras, I was warned that mistakes in Sanskrit pronunciation can be harmful. Is this true? No, I think the one thing that Maharishi had suggested was not to read Rig, Sama, Yajur, and Atharva Ved, because the pronunciation needs to be very precise. Pronunciation is important. I'm answering to Krista also. Pronunciation is important, but and the results will come according to your proficiency, and that's why we like, if possible, to learn from a Vedic pundit. If you have the opportunity to learn from someone who's trained their whole life, then the pronunciation will be more refined and your results will be more refined. So it won't be harmful if you mispronounce, but the results will be less good. But someone like myself, I enjoy doing it very much. I'm a native English speaker, and my pronunciation is not nearly as good as Acharya Dave, not even close, nor will it ever be probably in this lifetime. But nonetheless, good experiences come. So I'm very pleased with it. So I recommend it. I think it's something that's very valuable. Any other questions? Relationship between mathematics and Vedas and how it affects the brain. I'm not an expert on that, so I hesitate to say anything except that almost anything you do enlivens the brain in some way. There's this concept in modern brain physiology called functional holes in the brain. And what that means is when they inject like a radioactive isotope, it sounds awful, but they inject a radioactive isotope into the bloodstream, and then they take a picture of your brain. And they find that there are these dark areas in the brain that they're still there, but they're not functioning properly. They're called functional holes. They're not real holes, but they're functional holes. And functional holes come about from people who abuse alcohol and drugs is one thing. They also found that doctoral students at universities often develop functional holes in the brain simply because they focus on one area. They focus on one thing and one thing only, and they never do anything else. And so those parts of the brain that may deal with other areas of life become somewhat what you could say is atrophied. So if someone is a scientist and they studied, this one particle and this molecule is my molecule, and then there are parts of the brain that deal with art and poetry and music, and if the person doesn't attend to those, then they become atrophied. So when you do mathematics, you perform mental functions that are very important. It's very important to be very kind of broad. In the old days, education used to be very broad. You take some literature courses, you take some humanities, you take some mathematics, you take some science, you take everything. And that was actually quite good from the understanding of modern neurophysiology, because you enlivened all of the different parts of your brain. One study actually on Transcendental Meditation found that when individuals were practicing TM, as it's called often, the circulation went to all parts of the brain, every single part of the brain, not just this part, not just that part. When you learn to play a violin, the blood flow goes to the violin part. When you do some science, it goes to a different part. When you practice Transcendental Meditation, the circulation goes to the entire brain. and seem to enliven every part of it. But so mathematics is good, and Vedic science, doing anything having to do with Veda, reading the Vedic literature, reading Sanskrit literature, has that value of enlivening different elements of the brain, but in a more holistic way. I don't know if that was helpful. Anything else? Anybody want to type a question? Someone type thank you, and you're of course very welcome. So there don't seem to be any more questions. So we'll conclude this evening's session. Again, I want to thank you all. It's been really a delight for me, and I want to especially thank the Irash Gurukul team, who have been working so hard to make these kinds of presentations available to everybody. It's a fantastic undertaking, and I appreciate it, and I'm very, very honored to have been speaking this evening, and very appreciative, and thank you all very much. And please, everyone, stay online. So we'll play the Shanti mantra.